this child was hanging on. It was off the coast of Florida. This child was hanging on to an inner tube or some kind of life preserver or a float of some sort. I can't remember the details. And I remember first hearing a story that the child said he was saved by dolphins. This I read this, but and that the dolphins stayed with him until the rescue boat came. By the way, the young boy said that as he would slip from this float, the dolphins would push him back onto it. What does that mean? That means they have some understanding of what what the situation is, and they are helping. So that shows some altruism, empathy, and I think that's why the ancient Greeks may have been in awe of dolphins. They talked about them as they were intelligent because they observed them, they were at sea with them, much the way we see these dolphins bow riding on our boats. People love this. It engages us, it enchants us.
This French Circe wasn't your only Circe dolphin, because as you describe in your book, you have another relationship after that with a dolphin in California who you call Circe. And you chose the name Circe, and you've talked about her being a sorceress and certain elements of that, and then you chose that name for a reason, and it's an interesting and meaningful choice. The myths about the myths and tales of dolphins are often about communication, cooperation, and affection. And when you explain the ancient myths and folklore about encounters with dolphins, you say that you find truth in these tales, maybe a truth that it takes Western science centuries to find again. You say, for example, that the myths of Australian Aborigines express what you say, a reverence for dolphins, for their sacredness, their wisdom, their spiritual guidance. You say that these myths that portray dolphins as intelligent, wise, and compassionate are accurate and truthful. Besides the myths, there are dolphin stories, stories of dolphins rescuing people so that they don't drown. So myths aren't in themselves science, but they can still have a truth in them that maybe science doesn't have. Does that make sense for dolphin myths?
Yes, in fact, I started the frontispiece of my book is Arion, a Greek musician who was thrown overboard and reported that a dolphin took him to saved him by picking him up and taking him to shore. There's actually a statue of of this boy on the dolphin that exists today. And we don't know for sure if these are just tales that have been handed down and elaborated. We can't go back in time, and again, but we have these stories. So what might corroborate that now? Well, there are multiple newspaper reports, and I've got collections of these, of people saying they were also saved by dolphins. I'll tell you two of them right now because they're really wonderful. The first one has to do with many, many years ago, we heard of some people who were trying to come into our country, into Florida from Cuba. I think it was from Cuba, and they were their boat capsized, and they were coming in. I don't remember the exact story, but I don't think they were able to come in. This was before what's going on now with people coming into our country illegally. It was in the early days. And there was this little boy, Ilian Gonzalez, who had tried to come in with his family, his father, and others. And I don't, again, I don't remember the details, but this child was hanging on. It was off the coast of Florida. This child was hanging on to an inner tube or some kind of life preserver or a float of some sort. I can't remember the details. And I remember first hearing a story that the child said he was saved by dolphins. I read this, but and that the dolphins stayed with him until the rescue boat came. So now this is a 14-year-old child who's been in the sun. He may be hallucinating. He may be imagining this. Or is it real? It turned out that one of my neighbors, who lives a few apartment buildings away from me, was working with a local church, who was working with this young boy and his family. And she also spoke to the rescue group. There were, this has been documented on television, I think by Diane Sawyer and others. I followed up on it at the time. And the rescue group saw there were dolphins with him. And as they approached, the dolphins departed. So there's some verification there. I'll give you another example. By the way, the young boy said that as he would slip from this float, the dolphins would push him back onto it. What does that mean? That means they have some understanding of what the situation is, and they are helping. So that shows some altruism, empathy. We can sort of see what's going on here. Many years ago, I was doing a radio broadcast, and it was about elephants in Thailand. Apparently, that when they had a big tsunami, if you remember, in Thailand many years ago, there was people were calling in. I had done a study about elephants and elephant mirror self-recognition and elephants showing insightful problem solving. So one of the callers called in. It was a live radio show, and they mentioned that they had been saved by dolphins, even though it was about elephants feeling the tsunami because they can sense things in their feet. But this caller, knowing I worked with dolphins, said, "Dr. Reiss, my family and I were saved by dolphins. There's no one who's going to tell me it wasn't intentional, that they didn't know." They were in a boat, a small boat, a rowboat or a canoe, I don't remember what it was, or a Zodiac. They were slightly offshore. And he said they started seeing these triangular fins, thinking they were sharks around them. They got really scared. And it was unusual to see these fins circling their boat. And he said all of a sudden they realized they were dolphins, and they actually pushed their boat onto shore. And he said shortly thereafter, the tsunami hit. And he said if we had been out there, it would have been a disaster. He said they knew what was going on. Now, I wasn't there. I can't attest, but I've got a stack of articles of people that say the same kinds of things. And you can see this on occasion in aquariums, or it's been reported in the wild, where if an animal is injured, you'll see the other animals standing by or even holding them up so they can breathe. So I find that fascinating. Again, it's that pattern that connects us. We're completely separated by all these years of different evolution, 100 years of million years of evolution, yet we recognize the same behavior. And I think that's why the ancient Greeks may have been in awe of dolphins. They talked about them as they were intelligent because they observed them. They were at sea with them, much the way we see these dolphins bow riding on our boats. People love this. It engages us. It enchants us.
So, the myths that talk about a dolphin rescuing a human being um, can come from episodes that are witnessed and observed and documented. But what about the elements of myths about dolphins that go beyond that? That as you cite the myths of the Australian Aborigines, um, seeing a sacredness in dolphins, a wisdom in dolphins, a spiritual guidance in dolphins. Does that go beyond what we can document, and is it still a truth?
I can't really speak to that. I can just report the myths. But from my own experience as a scientist who studied them, I've studied them under very controlled conditions as well. I would say they're highly intelligent. I don't think we can fully characterize the nature of their intelligence, but I can show you from experiments I've done and others have done that they have a sense of they have a high social cognition. They have to track each other. They have to remember things. They have good memory. We have examples. These are anecdotally where they do things that may even look like a sense of humor. If we have time, maybe we can talk about that. But from studies of looking at their cognitive abilities in scientific studies that I've conducted, we found that they show vocal learning skills much like young children without us explicitly training them when given an underwater keyboard, which is one of the first studies I ever did, similar to what was done with chimpanzees, where they were given artificial codes so they could communicate with them. We had a keyboard that had 9 keys. It was interfaced with fiber optic cables to a computer so we could track everything the dolphins did. And we simply said, what would happen if we gave them choice and control? So that we were sort of responding to what they were requesting. And I watched what they were doing. They like to play with balls and rings. They like to get rubs and tickles from us. So we gave them that option of using different visual keys on a keyboard. And when they would push a key like a triangle that looked nothing like a ball, they would hear, and I'd give them a ball, or my student would give them a ball. When they hit a different key that looked like an H shape, they'd hear a different sound. And we did this with 2 moms and their newborn calves when they were 11 months old. Their calves within the first year. They weren't newborn when we started. But this is after we had recorded their own vocalizations and how their echolocation developed. Those were the first studies I did, watching and recording and reporting their behavioral development, their vocal development. That's a whole other thing. I'm not sure we're going to have time to get into all of that. And then I said, well, let's give them a choice and control over this system. And that was astonishing because very quickly they started imitating the sounds with great accuracy and even showed patterns like young children do. And then they showed that on their own, they started making associations between those sounds and the visual forms on the keyboard. So they could come up and whistle ball and then hit the ball key. They never made a mistake. They never hit the wrong key. That's amazing. Children often get them mixed up, but the dolphins didn't. And then they started even combining 2 of the whistles, ball and ring, in one continuous whistle through the second year of the study, when and only when they were playing with an invented game they made, which was hitting for a ball, hitting for a ring, throwing them up in the air and catching them together in their mouth. So you might say, but they probably heard that signal together, but they couldn't because we always made it so that there was a half a second of silence between them hearing a ring and a ball, even if they pushed them. So they combined them. So now we're using what they showed us to try to decode or translate their own communication signals. And that's what my colleagues and I are doing now with dolphins. We're studying dolphins in the wild and in sort of very natural lagoons where they're living in large groups, and trying to again translate the vocalizations that the dolphins are doing. And that's sort of the current work I'm doing, amongst other things.
So human scientists seem preoccupied with measuring intelligence and cognitive ability in dolphins and other intelligent species. But what about measuring compassion and empathy? Um, how would you do that with dolphins? And how do you think dolphins would rate for compassion and empathy?
Well, I think when we think about empathy, we think about having some theory of mind where you can imagine what it would be like in a situation. The things I just described to you, the observations that scientists have made of dolphin behavior in the wild or in aquariums where they're holding up other animals. If it looks like another animal is in need, you might see some kind of cooperative behavior, and that's been shown in dolphins. They do a lot of cooperative behavior in the wild. In fact, I mean, we've seen this ourselves. We've seen it in wild animals and in animals in zoos and aquariums where they will share responsibilities, like one animal babysitting while the other mother can rest. In our own facility, we had 2 births within 72 hours of each other. And the first mother who gave birth was constantly with her calf, being very vigilant. When the second mother gave birth, they both were vigilant and staying with their calves all the time. Young dolphins are called calves, by the way. And then eventually, one mother would babysit for both while the other mother would just rest. And I've seen that in the waters of Bimini when we did field work. We'd see just a few adult animals. We think they were females, but we weren't sure, with 7 or 8 calves. And then we would come upon that group a little bit later, and this was one day particular I'm remembering, where we had 3 or 4 adults, and then as we got to the 7 or 8 calves, it was 2 adults, and then finally we saw the same group of calves with one of the older adults. We could see she was older, determine that because she had more spots on her. The older dolphins of these spotted dolphins have more spots. So again, I think we have lots of evidence for empathy, and there have been papers written about this. One of my colleagues many, many years ago, Ken Norris, talked about that an observation where pilot whales, these magnificent black whales, were in the wild, he was observing, and one had been harpooned, I believe, by a Russian whaler. And the other two, this was published in, I believe, Sociobiology, a book by E.O. Wilson, and 2 other whales on either side held this animal up, the animal that had been harpooned, as the harpoon boat was pulling it towards the boat, putting themselves in harm's way. And as it got closer to the boat, they just didn't continue to hold it up. They actually pushed it down and took it away, which is would have been the proper behavior. So that shows very appropriate behavior as well as empathy. And I think there are lots of cases right now. There are cases of humpback whales that, and many people are wondering now whether humpbacks aren't showing empathy by intervening when killer whales may attack other animals. Killer whales will often, a certain subset of killer whales seems to be preying more on marine mammals now. And it may be due to a loss of food resources in their habitat, fish resources and things, because we have to be able to protect the habitats of these animals more for their food supply. And when there's certain kinds of pressures, it may force predatory species to start eating other species high on the food chain. But there have been a number of reports of humpbacks intervening when it's to save a young humpback, but also sea lions and even other species of marine mammals. So again, I will tell you that makes a lot of sense when I think about my own experience with a humpback once, but it's not clear yet. So people are being very cautious about not overstating it. You don't want to overstate it. At the same time, when you start looking collectively at these reports from different scientists and different domains, we want to stay open-minded, but you do need strong evidence. Marine mammals, the whales, whether it's humpback whales, whether it's gray whales, whether it's dolphins, they show this propensity to be curious and to be friendly, as we often call them, like the friendly gray whales. And I think these are big brained, highly social mammals that are curious. And we see it by them coming to our boat, looking up at us. If we're in the water, they'll often come over. They're not, they'll come close to you with your eye or watch from a distance. And, we see this kind of looking and whether we and gazing and approaching. And I think that's a very interesting way of thinking about curiosity. They seem to be interested and learning more about us. He found our boat and he pushed his belly against the side of our boat, this big humpback, and looked up at us with this big wet eye. And those of us on the boat who had been involved in the rescue, it included government officials. We all looked back with really wet eyes. We were all just crying. And we all felt that this whale understood something about what we tried to do, that we were there to help him. And at the time I thought, wow, did he really? Did he really? Even though it felt like that, you know, am I being too soft on this? Am I over interpreting this? And that would suggest he had some theory of mind or some sense of empathy. At that time, we hadn't heard these stories coming in about whales, about humpbacks showing possible empathy.